Sup, chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. So, on the last few episodes of the Haircafe show, I made it clear that I don't think that microneedling, at least when it's used by itself, is a very effective treatment for androgenic alopecia. In fact, I cringe when I see people rank it alongside actual clinically proven medications like finasteride and minoxidil, which have much greater evidence proving their efficacy. Now, I don't want to relitigate that today. I don't have anything against people who choose to use microneedling. I know that a lot of people like it, and I don't want to take that away from them, but rather I'd like to explore how microneedling can be used not as a standalone treatment, but rather as a delivery mechanism for new therapies. So, one of my fellow hair loss witchers brought to my attention a new treatment that is very preliminary. In fact, it has only been tested in animals so far, but what it is a therapy that uses microneedling as a means of administering a nanotechnological treatment rather than just being some fancy overpriced microneedle like we saw with Follica. Hopefully this is the type of nanotechnology that helps with hair loss and doesn't end up covering the planet in gray goo. So let's see what our friends in China have developed. China's reputation as a whole hasn't been great these past couple of years, and gee, I wonder why, but in terms of hair loss, they have been absolutely killing it. The Chinese company Kintor has developed several promising anti-androgen and WNT Wnt treatments for hair loss that I have covered and I'll link below, and one of them, Pyrilutamide, has even begun phase 2 FDA trials, and since the preliminary research has been promising, I cannot wait to get my hands on the phase 2 trial data once it becomes public. I mean, this is a big deal. We're talking about the progression of actual clinical trials here. We're not talking about a bunch of balding boomer bro scientists claiming that they can cure hair loss with broccoli or aspirin. This is real research we are talking about here. Anyways, it's not just the private sector in China that has been researching hair loss treatments, though. It turns out there's a lot of academic research going on over there as well. So even though we beat those red commie bastards in the space race, maybe they'll beat us in the hair loss cure race. So anyways, this study from China was published just a couple months ago, and it is titled, quote, "Cerium nanozyme integrated microneedles reshape the parafollicular microenvironment for androgenic alopecia treatment," unquote. Now, before I say anything about the study, though, let me just say I get a bit thrown off whenever I see androgenic alopecia spelled as androgenetic alopecia. I know that both terms are linguistically accurate, but I never have heard any other person say androgenetic alopecia, so who knows, maybe it's an academic thing. But let's get serious here for a moment, and let's see what this study is all about. Well, this paper doesn't talk much about androgens, which we all know are the root cause of androgenic alopecia, which of course is why it's called androgenic alopecia, but instead, this paper talks about the mechanisms by which androgens actually destroy the hair follicles. The researchers in the paper talk about two mechanisms. First, they talk about the destruction of the microvasculature of the hair follicle due to decreased vascular endothelial growth factor, or VEGF, which is known to be decreased in the hair follicles of androgenic alopecia patients. And this VEGF is important to maintain the tiny blood vessels that feed blood directly to the hair follicles. The researchers also talk about the possible role of excessive reactive oxygen species, or ROS, in androgenic alopecia, which can trigger premature conversion of the hairs in the anagen growth phase to telogen resting phase, and then suppress converting the hairs from the telogen resting phase back into the anagen growth phase. So basically, DHT, dihydrotestosterone, destroys hair follicles by interfering with their ability to produce hair, although there are multiple mechanisms including destroying the microvasculature and shortening the hair cycles involved as well. So finasteride obviously works since it controls DHT levels on the scalp, and DHT is the trigger for all of the downstream effects that destroy the hair follicles, but we've seen that there are ways for drugs to promote growth by going after those specific downstream effects without actually directly targeting DHT. For example, Wnt pathway drugs like SM04554 and WAY 316606 don't affect DHT, but they do target the downstream effects of DHT, and I'll link my videos on those Wnt pathway drugs down below if you haven't seen them yet. But even minoxidil is theorized to work on these downstream effects, although keep in mind, there are many theories towards minoxidil's mode of action, and the exact mechanism as to how it works is still debatable. So finasteride is a very effective drug that will work for over 90% of people who use it in both the short and the long term, but it only reduces DHT levels by roughly 60% or so. So even though that will be enough suppression for most people, there is still the matter of that 40% or so remaining DHT, which could possibly do some damage to their scalp hair on individuals who have a very strong case of androgenic alopecia. You could try dutasteride, which suppresses even more DHT, but even that will not suppress all the DHT on your scalp. So as it stands, there is no practical way to completely eliminate all DHT from the scalp. So rather than suppressing the remaining DHT on the scalp, we should find ways to target the downstream effects of the remaining DHT as a way to mitigate the damage to the DHT that isn't suppressed by 5A reductase inhibitors like finasteride and dutasteride. This is why it is often a good strategy to add a growth stimulant like minoxidil to a hair loss prevention stack to maximize the potential for success. Minoxidil is currently the very best growth stimulant we have on the market, but it certainly would be helpful if we could find other growth stimulants besides minoxidil, ones that may even work better, or just at the very least provide an alternative for those who don't respond well to minoxidil or are just sensitive to topical minoxidil. Finasteride is good enough as a standalone treatment for most people, and there's a study which shows that it continues to get benefits in its users even after 10 years of usage, and I have a video which discusses all that, and I'll link that below. But any innovation that can make finasteride even more effective will certainly be a welcome addition for any hair loss sufferer. So getting back to VEGF and these reactive oxygen species, this study looks at a new technology to enhance VEGF levels and destroy these harmful reactive oxygen species in the scalp, which again are downstream effects of DHT. So if hair loss were a video game, then the final boss would be DHT, and the reactive oxygen species would be the enemies you fight along the way. So the researcher strategy in this study is to use what's called cerium nanozymes. So what are cerium nanozymes? Well, again, we're talking about nanotechnology here, which is pretty cool and gives me flashbacks to shitty sci-fi video games. But anyways, what the heck is cerium? Well, if you do a Google search and you misspell it, you'll get a war-torn, politically unstable Middle Eastern country, or if you do spell it correctly, you'll find that it's the Indonesian word for cheerful. And also, it's the name for a brewing company here in Colorado, which I can't comment on since I don't drink. Eventually, though, you'll find that as it relates to the context of this video, it is an inorganic compound containing the rare earth metal cerium. And even though cerium is a rare earth metal, it actually is not that rare at all. It's even more common than lead, in fact. It's also easy to mine and extract. Anyways, ceria is an oxide of cerium, and it is used for things like polishing glass lenses, but from the biological point of view, it is an extremely powerful antioxidant and can prevent damage from reactive oxygen species in different parts of the body. As such, ceria has been used to treat liver injury, heal wounds, and even treat Alzheimer's disease. Now, it's important to note that when I say antioxidant, I am not talking about the type of antioxidant you'd see in something like food from fruits and vegetables. Those are good for you, of course, but there is no evidence they do anything for hair loss. Ceria, on the other hand, is a much more powerful locally acting antioxidant that needs to be delivered directly to the hair follicles and actually doesn't absorb through the skin or the digestive tract. So in order for it to work in the body, the cerium oxide, which is known as ceria, has to be formulated in a specific series of chemical steps that are outlined in this paper, but might seem like alchemy to the non-chemist. The end result, though, is cerium nanozymes, which are nanoparticles containing ceria. So, like I said, one problem with these cerium nanozymes is that they are large and don't penetrate the skin. So that's where the microneedling comes into play, since the researchers decided that in order to get the stuff into the hair, to the hair follicles, they had to use some kind of microneedling technique. They cite the research that microneedling might help with the drug delivery, and also some basic animal research that the trauma from microneedling might itself induce neovascularization and thus help with hair growth. Now, I've addressed this premise in some videos on microneedling, which I'll link below, but basically the human research shows that microneedling helps because it enhances the effects of minoxidil, probably by improving its delivery into the scalp, but at the same time, the evidence that microneedling by itself is useful is not very strong. Personally, I am not convinced microneedling is an effective treatment on its own, plus I also worry about the long-term effects of causing scalp trauma repeatedly over the course of decades of use, but you can watch my videos on this and read the studies and decide for yourself. At any rate, the investigators really had no choice but to use microneedling to deliver these nanoparticles to the hair follicles, since the nanoparticles will not absorb through the skin. So the researchers created a special microneedle patch that contained the cerium nanozymes inside the needles. This figure shows how they put the cerium nanozymes, or CENZs as shown here, into the needles, and then showed how they hoped the combination of both the CENZs and the stimulation of the needles would destroy the reactive oxygen species and restore the microvasculature of the hair follicles. So the researchers talk about how they created the nanozymes, and unless you are planning to make these things at home with your own chemistry set, I really don't think we need to go into great detail about how they did that, but here's what these nanoparticles look like under an electron microscope, which coincidentally looks like the United States, which is a little bit ironic since this is a Chinese study. Also, here's an image of the microneedling patch, and here's a microscopic image of the needles containing fluorescently labeled cerium nanozymes all ready to be released into the skin. So they did some preliminary testing to show that the cerium nanozymes were actually released into the skin by the needles. They showed the needles were strong enough to penetrate pig skin, which is very similar to human skin, which suggests this delivery system is reproducible in human subjects. And then they showed that the needles actually dissolved under the skin and released the nanozymes. So all that seemed to work as planned, and also being that the needles dissolve and don't need to be discarded, that reduces the risk of infection from repeatedly using the same microneedle over and over again. The main experiment used mice, so this is not human data, and this is very preliminary research. So mice, what's interesting about them is that they usually don't have androgenic alopecia, so a mouse model of androgenic alopecia had to be developed, and there are several ways to do this. The authors used a modification of a model used by Ryu, so I pulled up that article, and what Ryu did was, well, he basically took 7-week-old mice and shaved all their hair. So to mimic androgenic alopecia, they applied testosterone to the mouse hair daily, and this is the technique used in the Syria study too. Apparently, this excess testosterone keeps the hair from growing back. So this is the model of androgenic alopecia, but it's not really androgenic alopecia in that these mice don't have a genetic sensitivity to DHT the way humans with androgenic alopecia do. So you have to take these studies with a grain of salt. They may not be too applicable to humans who have androgenic alopecia. Now, one of the advantages of the mouse model is the hair cycles of the mice are all synchronized, so all the hairs are always in the same growth phase at the same time. It's different from humans where shedding occurs randomly and basically all the time, which is why people jump to the conclusion that finasteride isn't working for them just because they're going through a shedding phase or something. Now, if this isn't clear, I have a video talking about shedding, which I'll link below, but getting back to the study, the mice in the study were all 7 weeks old, which is when all the hairs of the mice are in the telogen resting phase. So another interesting difference in the hair between mice and humans is that in the mice, when the hairs enter the anagen phase, the skin turns dark, because unlike in humans, the hair follicles in the anagen phase of mice generate melanin, which is the pigment that makes the skin dark. So you can look at the back of a mouse and see what phase its hair is in just by its pigmentation alone. So what did the researchers test for in these shaved mice? Well, they divided the mice into 4 groups. All groups of mice had their hair shaved at 7 weeks of age and had testosterone applied topically to mimic androgenic alopecia. The researchers noted that all the groups of mice after they just shaved it, bro, looked like Jason Statham and Bruce Willis. But anyways, the first group was just a control group. All they got was the testosterone and no other treatment. The second group got the cerium microneedle patch applied 4 times during a 28-day period, as you can see here. The third group got a microneedle patch without cerium nanozymes, and the fourth group had minoxidil 5% solution applied daily until day 13. Photographs and tricograms were done to assess the results. So what did they find? Well, some typical results are shown in these mice photos. The first row shows the mice had just gotten testosterone without any treatment, and there are no black hairs seen after day 28, which indicates there were no hairs in the anagen growth phase, and in fact, there was no hair growth at all. So let's skip to the last row with the mice who got 13 days of topical minoxidil. You can see a growth spurt at day 21, and even better growth at day 28. If you then look at the third row where the mice got the cerium nanozymes delivered via the microneedling patch, the final results look comparable to minoxidil, but the improvement seemed to start a little earlier at day 14. So remember, the darkening of the skin in the mice is due to hairs in the anagen phase, so it looks like the cerium nanozymes accelerate the transition from the telogen to the anagen phase compared with minoxidil, though the end result looks pretty similar overall. Finally, the second row is just microneedling alone, and there is improvement over no treatment, but it is not as good as the improvement with the cerium nanozymes or minoxidil. So like in some other mouse studies, microneedling alone may have some mild effect, though it doesn't look as good as minoxidil, not even close. Although again, this is just a mouse study, and it's possible that in human trials this would show completely different results. And also, these are just representative results. I mean, how did the groups do overall, I wonder? Well, looking at the results in these graphs, the top graph shows an increase in hair diameter with the treatments, and it shows an equivalent improvement of hair growth with the cerium nanozymes and minoxidil, which is better than the control mice or the microneedling alone. The middle graph shows something called Ki67 positive cells, and what Ki67 is, it's a marker of cell growth and shows the best result in the cerium nanozyme mice. Finally, the bottom graph shows the hair cycle score, which means the percent of hairs in the anagen versus telogen phase, and again, the cerium nanozymes look the best here. Though the difference between minoxidil and the cerium nanozymes, though it looks large, was not statistically significant. In all the graphs, the microneedling alone group looks a little better than the control group, though it doesn't look like the differences were statistically significant. They didn't show it in a figure in the paper, but they also tried applying the cerium nanozymes topically and with an injection to the scalp as well, but that had no effect at all. So the delivery system via microneedles seems to be the only viable way to deliver this treatment. They then did some biochemical and microscopic studies on skin biopsies from the mice. These graphs show some of these results. The top two graphs look at two different kinds of reactive oxygen species, and the cerium nanozymes reduced these as expected, as did minoxidil, though to a lesser extent. The slight reduction in these oxidants with just microneedling alone was not statistically significant. The third graph from the top shows that microneedling, cerium nanozymes, and minoxidil all increase the number of blood vessels, meaning the microvasculature of the hair follicles, though the cerium nanozymes delivered through the microneedles increase the microvasculature the most. The last graph looks at VEGF, which, as I said earlier, is vascular endothelial growth factor, which is a growth factor that causes blood vessels to grow. So it's a good thing that unfortunately DHT destroys. All the therapies increase VEGF, though again, the cerium nanozymes seem to do it the best. So what can we conclude from all this? The researchers conclude that cerium nanozymes delivered through specially designed dissolvable microneedles cause hair growth at least as good as minoxidil, and that they accelerate the anagen growth phase of the hair follicles. The cerium nanozymes are good antioxidants and also promote growth of the microvasculature of the hair follicles, but this study shows that minoxidil also has similar effects, so unless further research can demonstrate this nanozyme technique as being superior to minoxidil, then it seems at best this is just a minoxidil alternative to the few people who cannot tolerate minoxidil or just don't respond very well to it. Microneedling by itself also had some effect on the microvasculature, though its effects on hair growth were inferior to minoxidil or the cerium nanozymes plus microneedling. Once again, though, it looks like microneedling works best as a drug delivery system rather than as a primary treatment for hair loss. It's also interesting that microneedling had no effect on hair diameter, because that's what the study I reviewed on microneedling alone in humans also showed. So there's some consistency there. So we've seen the study in mice, but is any of this applicable to humans, you may wonder? Well, I don't know. The model of androgenic alopecia in mice is really not the same as human androgenic alopecia, where there is a genetic sensitivity to DHT. Also, mouse hair growth is not the same as human hair growth, because as we've already discussed, the hair growth cycle in mice is all synchronized, compared to the human scalp hair where it can be random. I don't really know for sure how much these reactive oxygen species play a role in human alopecia. It may be more important in mice than it is in humans, but maybe decreasing them is one of the mechanisms as to why minoxidil works. Of course, what we're talking about is only a couple of the many downstream effects that DHT causes, which inevitably leads to the destruction of the hair follicle in people who have the genetic condition androgenic alopecia. So since it is just one of the many downstream effects that could occur, this could never be a full-blown replacement for finasteride, just as minoxidil can't ever be a full-blown replacement for finasteride. DHT destroys the hair follicle by many mechanisms, including the effects on VEGF and possibly via reactive oxygen species, but it also destroys the hair follicle through the Wnt pathway, and also via other positive and negative growth factors, such as suppressing IGF-1, which is a positive growth factor, as well as enhancing TGF-beta-1, which is a negative growth factor. It also has effects on prostaglandins and and probably other signaling pathways, and being that this is mechanistic data, it's possible or even probable that DHT is also destroying the hair follicles in ways we haven't even discovered yet. So even though these drugs which target these specific downstream effects of DHT are interesting and could very well be useful, they will never be as effective as treatments that target DHT itself, because when you target the DHT, you're targeting all the downstream effects, not just selecting a few. So you can take out as many TIE fighters and Star Destroyers as you like, and that may help, but unless you actually take out the Death Star, then the Rebel base is still going to get blown the fuck up and you're going to go bald. So with that, may the Force be with you, Chooms. I'll see you next time. Take care.